And I'll only add, I was, as Barry mentioned, not planning on being part of this event. There are very few people for whom I would have done this about-face, and it was absolutely an honor to be able to be doing this with you. A year ago, you were joined us on a very differently themed event on the next world system, and you presented the Biden administration's vision for trade policy. And as part of that, you focused on the need to shift away from a trade system that saw people primarily through the lens of being consumers. And I'm going to quote from you. You said that what is at stake is the ability of Americans as workers, consumers, innovators, inventors, content creators, entrepreneurs, and community members to enjoy their rights to privacy and liberty and their access to democracy and opportunity. So can you tell us a bit more about how your approach to trade relates to democracy?
Yes, absolutely. I'm delighted to be here with you, Audrey. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. And this is the one-year anniversary of that. It was an incredible experience for me to be here with all of you last year. I do love this very, very pointed question about, well, you know, essentially, what is the trade rep doing here at a conference where our focus really is on democracy? And there are a couple of ways for me to come at this. One of them is just to tell the story of what we're trying to do on trade right now in the Biden administration. President Biden gave us a couple instructions at the very beginning of the term. The first one was, as the trade rep, you are part of the foreign policy team, so you must demonstrate to the rest of the world that America is back. The second one, you are part of the economic policy team, so you must be an active member of the team to restore a sense of opportunity to ordinary Americans, to help us grow the middle class, and to help us create a pathway for those who are not in the middle class to join the middle class. That's what he means by middle-out economics. And so for trade, then, what he asked for was, please do trade in a new way that puts the interest of our workers at the center. And so we call it the worker-centered trade policy. And really what our orientation is to conceive of the human being in our economy as more than just a consumer, but also a worker, content creator, small business owner, entrepreneur, and remind ourselves that in the world of trade policy, in these very kind of airy, esoteric, elite conversations that we find ourselves in, to never lose sight of the fact of who you're working for, which is the American people. And that focus on the people, I think, really brings us back to the core of the idea of democracy, which is in that Greek, I think, word demos, which means the people. And so it's about keeping in our minds the goal to grow the middle class, to create more economic opportunity for whom? For our people. And I think that that is the foundation for our thinking about trade and our conviction that what we do in trade policy is directly tied to the values and the vitality of our democracy.
And there was another statement that you made in that speech, which I feel like went under the radar at the moment, but has since its importance has become much more clear. So I'll quote once more. You mentioned that trade policy must respect the space for our domestic policymakers, regulators, enforcement officials, and legislators to debate and determine appropriate frameworks governing the relationship between government, technology, business, and the public interest. So we've heard a lot today about, and I'll cite Courtney, who mentioned as well about this growing threat from these dominant tech players who leverage their market power and turn that into political power. And so I want to go back to the statement you made. How does that relationship between those four groups, right, the government, technology, business, and the public interest, fit into those concerns that you mentioned about democracy?
Certainly. So I think it's really important when we're talking about policy space to create the space for policy debate, for decision-making on the part of a government, on the part of a country. What are we talking about? This is where I think that on the left and the right, we use slightly different terminology, but we're really talking about the same thing and the same concept. We talk a lot about public policy space, the space for our policymakers and leaders to forge policies on behalf of the United States. I think that on the right, more often than not, the same concept is expressed using the terminology of sovereignty, that, a country gets to decide for itself what it's going to do. It's about its own governance. When you bring both of those concepts together, though, it is about the ability of America and American people to decide the policies that are going to govern the American economy, the American polity. And what we are very, very conscious of and sensitive to is the role of trade policy, trade negotiators, the international trading system to complement our system, but not to supersede it. That it is our responsibility to figure out what the right balance is between the roles of the technology companies, our government, our civil society, our people, in determining the rules that govern here. And how, as the trade representative, I and my agency and the administration here can participate in a way where we can complement but not overtake or put a thumb on the scale in terms of defining the space where America decides for itself and where America can't decide for itself because it's already been decided through an external process somewhere very far away amongst a bunch of elites.
And so much of today's conversation has been about shaping the tech sector through tech policy. And I want to define what that means in the trade space, right? When we talk about trade, people usually are thinking about, container ships filled with physical goods. And if we're talking about technology trade, we're thinking of iPhones and the semiconductors being shipped from one country to the next. But the digital economy is less tangible. And yet that also falls in your remit of what you're looking at. So when we talk about digital trade, what exactly is the good that is crossing borders that is being looked at?
Yes. This is such a great question because the digital trade conversation, it's been hard. I was actually asked by a senator, and I went in to talk to him, and I said, I think that is important for us to talk about digital trade. And he's not on my committee of jurisdiction, but he is working on issues that relate to democracy and opportunity. And so he started by saying, okay, just back up. Please define digital trade for me. And I thought, this is a really important moment for me to try to articulate what it is. And what I've managed to do is to be able to tell a very short story, which is for a long time, what we have thought about in the trade realm is rules for e-commerce. This started 20 years ago. I think it was the Singapore FTA where we had the first e-commerce chapter. And if you think about 20 years ago, that was the early 2000s, when Amazon was still an online bookstore, really. That was mostly all that Amazon was at the time. And so when we were thinking about rules for e-commerce that, relate to trade, it was about the rules that would foster a positive environment for goods to cross borders in a traditional trade transaction sense. And so maybe it was the bits and bytes that would facilitate the kind of traditional trade transaction. Jump forward now, 20-some years later, and when we're talking about digital trade, what's very, very quickly obvious as you become fluent in the debates that are going on right now and all the conversations that have happened here today, is that digital trade is no longer just about facilitating traditional trade transactions. There's a little bit about it, but really the bits and bytes that we used to think about as basically just, greasing the wheels of international commerce have now become the thing of value in itself. And that is the data. We are deep in the era of big data. Data is extremely powerful, especially when you've accumulated it. The amount of information that's in there, what you can know about people, really specifically, and what you can do with that knowledge is amazing and also terrifying at the same time. And you also have to link it back to the business models of all of these technology companies. And this is where that seminal work by Shoshana Zuboff called Surveillance Capitalism comes into play. We have our own silos in terms of our policy areas. And so when surveillance capitalism was first mentioned to me, I couldn't unpack it. I now appreciate surveillance capitalism is a capitalistic business model that is built on collecting all of our data, monetizing that, making it really profitable. And then the questions that arise in there around rights. What are your privacy rights? What are your rights to the data that you've generated that you're not being compensated for? What are your rights if you're a content creator, a creative, in terms of copyright? There are currently some very, very high-profile litigation going on around artists whose work has been used to feed the OpenAI, ChatGPT generative AI model, who are completely uncompensated for a long recognized right that they've had. In light of all of that development, what's become clear is digital trade is incredibly consequential in a way that goes beyond the traditional realm of goods transactions to affecting all of these aspects of not just our economy, but the fundamental power balance and our information ecosystems, our society, and then ultimately also our democracy.
And when, I want to say, in the last few decades, especially following the Cold War, so much of the assumption around trade was that free trade or allowing more goods to transfer across borders, especially in the digital realm as well, that would help pro-democracy forces and would strengthen democracies around the world. And that meant that we didn't really need to worry about whether our trade partners were democracies or autocracies. And as a result, many of our largest trade partners are autocratic governments or countries with autocratic governments. So today, as we think about the threats that autocracies pose to democratic societies and the ways that they use technology to do this, how should the U.S. negotiate on issues like digital trade with trade partners who are also accused of using technology to undermine democracy?
This is a really great and profound question. We can review a little bit of the history and go back to the 1930s through World War II to the founding of Bretton Woods, which I think next month we're coming up on the 80th anniversary. So it's been 8 decades of this post-World War II Bretton Woods system that is built on the rock of a transatlantic commitment and partnership of what we would now call market-based democracies to invest in each other, to work together, and to together fend off the threats coming from non-market autocracies. Threats from the left of communism, threats from the right, from fascism. And I think that's a really important frame to keep in mind. Because of the power of data married up with who owns that data, whether in our system it's a lot of concentrated power in the private sector, in our companies, or in these autocratic systems where the data is ultimately held and possessed by these non-democratic governments, I think it is absolutely something we have to think very, very carefully about when we're negotiating these types of deals, which is who are you negotiating with? Not all governments are the same. And what is the balance that you are striking between companies and the government, between the governments, and then how are you taking into account that there are other voices, there are other entities and other people and communities and sectors with rights that need to be reflected in these types of arrangements. So they're really, really important questions, and they're ones that we really have to pay attention to. They're not necessarily the questions that have come up in our traditional goods trade agreements, even though I think even in those cases, they're questions that we should have been asking all along, because as it turns out, just trading more with autocratic governments, just making them richer, didn't make them more democratic. It just made them richer. And that's something that we're having to contend with every single day today.
And I think I have time for one more question. So I'm going to flip the question, or flip the side there in terms of who our trading partners are. This event, the very first speaker that we had was European Commission's Executive Vice President, Margrethe Vestager. And she described the democratic values shared between the US and Europe in the post-war years. And she highlighted liberty, choice, and pluralism, and discussed the way that informed the project of European integration. And you were just discussing the Bretton Woods institutions as well. Like, those post-war years were clearly ones in which the concerns about protecting democracy from illiberalism were top of mind for world leaders. And that informed all of these institutions that were created. So in light of that history, in light of everything that we've heard today about the threats that disinformation poses to journalism and that disruptions to information systems pose to our democracy, how can trade policy contribute to combating some of those threats?
That's a great question. So I'm going to answer it in two parts. The first part is there are actually many, many ongoing digital trade negotiations right now in the world. And the United States is a part of a number of these negotiations. I wanted to first just say that there's some crazy rumor mill out there that the United States opposes these negotiations going forward. That is not true, including at the WTO. The United States is committed to being a part of these negotiations, but we're also committed to pressing our fellow trade negotiators to open their minds and to realize that what they're negotiating is about more than just the grease of, facilitating the cogs of international traditional trade transactions. That what is implicated, or what can be implicated in these negotiations, is really significant and consequential, and that we as trade negotiators have a responsibility to break out of our silos, to break out of the silo of our own traditions, and to start asking questions, and to start connecting the dots, and being able to answer the question, what exactly is it that we're negotiating, and how does it advance our interests, whether it's economic opportunity, and more of it, whether it's supporting democracy. So that's my first answer to your question. The second part of my answer to your question is I'm going to tell a little bit of a story here. I know that, I had the incredible honor to meet the great Maria Ressa at the Summit for Democracies hosted in Seoul, not last year, but the year before. And I got a chance to talk to her, truly inspiring. And it was around that time that she was just publishing her book, which is How to Stand Up to a Dictator. And I know that Maria actually was very, very interested in coming to this conference, but couldn't make it work with her travel schedule. But I just wanted to take a moment, and I hope she doesn't mind, to talk a little bit about what I learned from my conversation with Maria and my own reading of her book, which is I knew what she had gone through during the Duterte years in the Philippines, being very specifically targeted as a journalist by the government. And so I started reading her book, expecting that that was the story she was going to tell. And to be fair, that is part of the story she tells. When she calls the book How to Stand Up to a Dictator, Duterte is one of the figures she's talking about. But he's not the only one, because the other part of the story that she tells is about the hope that she had early on with the advent of social media in terms of the democratizing opportunities of spreading information to more people, giving them the tools to make decisions about their lives and how they engage with their fellow countrymen, and then seeing how that hope was distorted. And the second part of her story, in How to Stand Up to a Dictator, that second dictator is Mark Zuckerberg. And her experience with Facebook and seeing what the Facebook algorithms were doing starting in 2014 to distort the information ecosystem. And what's happened since then, which is a lot of what we're living through right now. And so I think, if I'm going to bring this answer together, it's going to be, what can trade policy do to be a force for good in this age of digital transformation? What we can do as trade negotiators, as trade policy professionals, is to actively participate in breaking down the silos that keep us in our lane, and to connect ourselves to more conversations, to the antitrust community, to the journalism community, to everyone out there who cares about the things that we care about in our democracy, around economic opportunity, around political participation, around the integrity of our information ecosystems, and understand that today everything is connected, and understand the role that we are playing to make sure that the role we are playing is going to be a positive one. And we don't accidentally, because we have deal fever, because we are programmed as trade negotiators to show that we can conclude trade agreements, it is more important to understand what it is we're negotiating and what effect that's going to have on our country, on our democracy, and on the world. And I think that that's where I will end my answer, which is to say thank you so much for this opportunity to engage with all of you, to be a part of this conversation, and to allow me to break out of my silo of trade to engage with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you again to Ambassador Tai. I'm going to pass it back to Courtney and Barry.